Segue, to continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue, to make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
To move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue, to perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue, to make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello everybody. Anne Craver is a native of St. Louis, Missouri. She has obtained a number of degrees from La Nouvelle Sorbonne in Paris and St. Louis University, receiving her doctorate in comparative literature from Washington University in St. Louis, and a law degree in international and comparative law from St. Louis University. She recently visited Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, where she delivered a lecture on French culture in St. Louis. Welcome to Segue, Dr. Craver.
Oh, thank you very much.
From the very beginning, you show a great deal of interest in your career about foreign languages, right? And you learn French. I understand you also learn Mandarin. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Correct.
Mandarin. And yes. Why was that? Because it sounds like French and Mandarin don't have too much in common. So why was that interest, and why do you choose those two particular languages?
Well, I started my French study at the Academy of Visitation in the first grade, and then when I got to high school, I was getting a little bit bored, so they allowed me to add Spanish. So as you know, Spanish is, as a Romance language, is closely connected to French. But then one summer before my senior year of high school, I was looking for something to do, and a friend of mine and I decided to look into some summer programs, and we discovered Mark Twain Summer Institute that was started by Dr. Stanley Spector, connected with Washington University, professor of history there. And it was a great opportunity for high school students to take things that were not normally offered during a high school curriculum. So when we saw Chinese, it just jumped out at us. And I have to say, I mean, I've always enjoyed Chinese cuisine, you know.
Okay. So that's what the connection is.
Yes, my parents gave us a variety of different cuisines as children. And I was familiar with, of course, American-style Chinese. But that was the first notion I had of Chinese and Chinese culture, and it was a great program. It was a great introduction to Chinese, and we continued it at Washington University on Saturday mornings during my senior year of high school. And then when I got to university, I decided to continue my studies in Chinese.
Okay. But then you went to France to actually expand your French connection, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. Would you say that in order to really learn a language, you have to live for a while in the country where that language is spoken?
I think for fluency, this is what I told my parents at the time. I said, you know, I've studied all this French language, but I'm still not getting the fluency I know. And there's so much that doesn't exist in books. I mean, the books that I was dealing with back then were very limited in really presenting the culture and idiomatic expressions, and people would tell me, some teachers would say, oh, that's just slang, that goes out of the language. But no, there's some expressions that are used in everyday life, as you well know, and that don't go out of the language, but you can't learn them from books. So really being with the people, I think I encouraged all my students when I was teaching to try to go. Of course, it costs money, and a lot of students can't afford. That's why when I was a teacher during my master's program at St. Louis University, I went to the department and I said, why can't we offer a basic conversational course for students that have just had 1 year of university college French? And so they said, well, we can't pay you for it. And I said, well, that's fine, because I had the class. After 1 year, I had students coming up to me and said, I can't afford to go to France, but I'd really like to improve on my conversational skills. So we met. I told them, you can audit it. You can meet 1, 2, or 3 times a week. I'll be there for 3 hours, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And so I had a group of about 12 students that would come at different times, and we just spoke. And I said, don't just speak like you would try to speak in English, and don't be embarrassed. I'm not going to be correcting you right away. Well, I'll correct you later, okay? But I just want you to speak during this hour that we're together.
And then you decided to get a law degree. That sounds like a big jump in a different direction. How did that happen?
Well, it happened because not only do I have French and Chinese and Spanish, but I also went back and studied Portuguese, and also then Arabic and Persian languages, and Serbo-Croatian. People kept calling me with different immigration problems. So that's what I thought. I better learn immigration law myself, because I would pass these questions on to other lawyers that I knew, and I thought I better go back and learn the law myself, which I wanted to do. But it sounded crazy after a PhD then to go back for a law degree. Yeah. I know. Yeah.
And then you decided to start working on a very famous novelist, André Chedid.
Chedid, yes.
Who was she? Explain that to because although she is well known in the literary circles, I don't think she's that popular among the general public.
Well, and she's not that well known in the United States. She's well known in the Francophone world, but she is someone who is a humanist. She is someone who started her career in poetry, but expanded into writing 13 novels, 2 of which became films, Le Sixième Jour, The Sixth Day, or L'Autre, the other. And then she wrote 6 plays, 2 of which were presented at La Comédie Française, which is a compliment to her writing of theater. And then she wrote over 100 short stories.
Okay.
And so, but I worked on her 21 volumes of poetry, because poetry is my first love.
Now, I understand she was an author who in many ways questioned human condition.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about that fascinating facet of her writing, because I mean most people have a problem understanding that humans are questioning humans in many ways.
Yes. Well, I believe that she was a woman ahead of her time, in the sense that she really pointed out in her novels and writing about minorities, about women's problems, especially that you see the link between the Middle East and Europe for her, because she was born in Cairo and she had Lebanese roots, and then became a French citizen after World War II, both she and her husband, in 1946 in Paris. So, but she wanted to bring out not just the human condition, but specific problems of minorities and women.
And I think that you mentioned Lebanon. I think she was always questioning the conflicts that have happened.
Correct.
In that country, which is kind of sad, because for many years Lebanon was considered to be the Swiss of the Middle East.
Correct.
But then they got into this infighting that pretty much destroyed the country for a while.
Correct.
Do you think that because of that you find some sort of multiculturalism in her writings? So you see not only the European but also the Middle East influences in there?
Definitely. She always said to me, because we became great friends over the years, we had many interviews together, and she said that she thought you could see this multiculturalism in her writings of her short stories and novels, but not so much in her poetry. And what we see, for instance, in her novel La Maison sans Racines, which was translated into English, Return to Beirut, we see this friendship between a Christian girl and a Muslim girl. And then we see also this scenario takes place in Beirut. So we also see what's going on is the not only the differences in religion between these two girls, but also their upbringing. The Christian girl is more brought up in a European household, and the Muslim girl more in a Middle Eastern household. So,
and I think that's a fascinating aspect, because the issue of women in the Middle East is quite different than the way we see it in the West. I mean, I just today was reading the newspapers and read that a pregnant woman in Pakistan was stoned to death just because she chose to marry a man that wasn't the one chosen by her parents. And I think that although there are many degrees in which the relationship between women and men happen in the Middle East or in Islamic countries, I don't think people in the West have a real appreciation of how complex that issue is. Do you think that that's something that she did basically talk about to a certain extent in her writings?
yes, well, I think she was appalled by the violence against women, which she talks about in one of her first novels, which is Le Sommeil délivré, from Sleep Unbound. And she talks about this woman who is basically kept prisoner in her home by her husband, and also the violence committed against her, and she was appalled by this, and this is why she tried to bring this out through her writings. Now, of course, there was all individual cases, but I think that she tries to bring out the struggle that women have, and she felt that she was fortunate in her own household, that she had parents that sent her to boarding school in France so that she could see another world. And of course she felt herself from a very privileged society because she came from an aristocratic family. She knew that she was privileged over people that did not have the chances that were given to her.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Shadid is well known in the Francophone world, but I was wondering that because of her writings, to what extent the reception of her writings in Arabic countries and Islamic countries in particular has been, because obviously she has been touching these delicate issues.
Well, it's been what I did for my dissertation. I actually looked at articles written in Arabic, since Arabic was one of my languages, and translated those with the help of another individual, and it was very positive. In fact, everyone wants to claim her. That's her claim to fame, is because people, if you go to a bookstore and you say, I want some works by André Chédid, they'll go, oh, isn't she that Lebanese writer? Oh, isn't she that Egyptian writer? Everybody wants her. So that is, but it was very, now this would not be probably the Muslim clerics or somebody else, they're not writing the articles, but the journalists throughout the Middle East claimed her for their own, and really loved her writing. Okay.
Well, now let's change a little bit of geography. Let's talk about St. Louis, which is where you live and work, and which you have done some studies about that. I think most of our audience have this general idea that yes, there has been some influence because the name is still St. Louis and the Louisiana Purchase and that kind of things. But do you feel that the American public in general, and particularly people even living in St. Louis, have a full understanding of the French influence in St. Louis as a city?
I don't think they do. I think that they have some notion that we were founded by two Frenchmen, Pierre Laclede and Auguste Chouteau, but beyond that, they really feel that what do we have around us that's really French anymore, which we have, unfortunately, very little to show around us. That is why I'm very excited with my research that shows that when I came here, I was very honored to be asked to speak at SIUE about a French language newspaper, La Revue de l'Ouest, and Louis Cortombert, its editor. I was able to compose a map of French businesses that were located underneath the arch. what we would know as First and Second and Third Street. First Street was in the day was Main Street, and of course those streets had French names before that was changed in 1826 by the mayor and the aldermen in the day that wanted to change more like Philadelphia and gave us all names of trees.
Okay. So in a way we can say that there was at least a portion of the population in St. Louis that even all the way to the 19th century they were still speaking and communicating among themselves in French.
Yes, even though there was an influx of Germans coming into the city, constant immigrants, also Italians, but these people knew French, and the primary language was French.
Now, when you read those newspapers, do you find the French spoken in St. Louis somehow different from the French from France? And I'm asking that question because in Canada, for example, when they speak French, there are some differences in the way they speak French. In comparison with France in terms of how they say 80 instead of 4 times 20 and that sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that kind of difference also in the French spoken in St. Louis in the 19th century?
Well, I'm basing this upon my reading of this newspaper that is in 1854, and I would say that, of course, there's already differences between 19th century French and modern-day French, but in addition to that, what I find is an incorporation of English words coming into the language as we find in Canada. Sometimes the word is used in French, and sometimes it'll be in English in the middle of a French sentence. That they'll just say marshes instead of le marais or something like that. So that I'm kind of surprised with reading, but sometimes they will use an English word from now and then. But I mean, they're using words such as rubbish, instead of a word, les ordures, in French for modern day French.
Okay.
So.
Now, of that group of French-speaking people in St. Louis in the 19th century, what were the major occupations? In other words, what kind of trades they were involved at that time? What kind of businesses?
Well, that was my great interest in this newspaper, was to see the advertisements of the day, and a lot of them were involved in what St. Louis has become to know for in its history in fur trade. Of course, fur trade was extremely important still in the 19th century, and for shoes then related to leather goods, pasta. The Italians were coming in and advertising their pasta. There was a lot of iron works because we were starting to build up our industry, our foundries, so there was need for iron and steel. There was, I'm trying to see, chapeau, the hats, lots of hats, milliners, and let's see, what else? What else did I find? Of course, the bankers are always advertising, 4 or 5 banks. But there was also boarding houses advertised because that was a place for the single person when they were coming into a city to live. There was not so many hotels. Hotels were starting to develop at that time, but for the single person, the boarding houses were the places of lodging.
About what time would you say that lively French culture practitioner, so to speak, disappear from St. Louis? When did they stop speaking French and then they stop publishing the newspapers and that kind of things? When was that period of time where that happened?
Well, that's a real gray area, I think, because we have a French language newspaper that's published beyond the La Revue de l'Ouest that's called Le Patriote, and it's still in publication in the 1870s, so after the Civil War in St. Louis. But I would say probably beginning of the 20th century, then there's still, as we know, in St. Genevieve, Missouri, a great French population that's ongoing. and still remnants of it in Old Mines, Missouri. But in St. Louis, the French moved mainly south of the downtown area towards Soulard area, what we know today. And I believe just little by little that we did not have that ongoing influx of French immigrants to the Midwest, and that's why I believe that I would say probably about that time, the German population continued, I think, more strongly in the sense that they had schools set up, for elementary schools, where they continued in German language and spoke it at home. Whereas the French, they did a bit of that. We have a school advertised in La Revue de l'Ouest, a couple of schools that are for young ladies to learn their French. But I think probably around the beginning of the turn of the century, although you have a great presence in St. Louis still of the sisters who came from France, such as the Visitation Sisters, the Sacred Heart Sisters of Ville de Chêne, those Catholic institutions that established the schools, they were still trying to keep the French presence going with the study of French.
So would you say that because the immigration of the French from France stopped at some point, that French population integrated itself into the American culture?
Correct. I believe so because as you know, the transfer of from the French to the Spanish, and the Spanish basically let the French administration of the day still continue to control, even though the Spanish were really in control of St. Louis in the day. They just let the French still continue whatever they were doing, and then it was a short transfer from France to the United States for the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase, and then in that day, I think that was about the end of, because Napoleon, of course, wanted to settle in the United States, as we know, in New Orleans, and that never happened. But for the French, they were still hopeful that they would have this area for their own, correct? I mean, before it was sold, and after that, then the immigration stopped. Yeah.
Now, I was wondering if, after listening to this conversation we're having here in this program, someone approaches you and say, show me what is left today of the French influence in St. Louis. What would you show to that person?
I'm often asked that question, so
You're prepared
I love
for it.
to. Yeah, well, right away I take a lot of tourists around town, so right away I would show them the Demenil House. That's one of our last French homes standing. It's called the Châtillon Demenil because for Henri Châtillon, who was a fur trapper, and Nicolas Demenil, his family. So it's a double name, Châtillon Demenil House, and they still have tours of that home, and we can see period furniture and lighting. The light fixture that hangs in the front hall, for instance, was from Paris. So that's what I would show them. I would show them just now, recently, due to the federal law that was just passed, we are finding with the excavations for down near the riverfront in the area of Chouteau. I can't remember the name of the landing there. It's not Leclede's Landing. I believe it's called Chouteau's Landing. Yes, that they're discovering early colonial homes because they were dug so deep that now they're keeping those. They're trying to preserve those, which they unfortunately did not during the construction of the arch.
Now, you mentioned earlier that at the same time there was this French colony in St. Louis, there was also a German colony.
Sure.
And being both Europeans, I was wondering, what was the major differences between both of those colonies, the French and the German?
Well, the French were pretty appalled when the Germans came to town because the Germans loved their beer. So we had, I think at one time in St. Louis, 32 breweries going before Prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the French started to move south into the Soulard area, because they really wanted to kind of distance themselves from the Germans and their drinking, because the French enjoyed finest wine still, and certain etiquette, and they really didn't understand this German culture coming in with their drinking. Yes, so there were great differences between them. But basically even though the French, I would say, some of the first founding families of St. Louis, they wanted to marry their daughters or sons to other French families. Mm-hmm. So and even if they were from France, which is Louis Cotonbert was born and raised in France, and when he came to St. Louis, he married Suzanne Chouteau. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure the family was delighted, because this is what the families wanted.
Okay. Now, let me ask you a question. Since you have all these different degrees, to what extent being a lawyer helps you in your literary studies, if any?
If any, well, I would reverse the question. I would say how literature really helps me with my law, because I think it keeps me sane, because the law is so dry at times that when any time I can go back to my poetry, I love it. It's a great delight. Mm-hmm. But there are certain crossovers where I can help, either if I'm wearing my lawyer's hat, and I have, for instance, we just published a book on André Chédid in tribute to her in Paris, and if there were some legalities that came up in the contract, I could use my lawyering to help with that, or vice versa. If in my literature, basically, I think I always told my law school friends, I'm off to read some poetry now, because after so much law, yes, I have enough, yes.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I have heard that companies that have to do business in Europe sometimes hire lawyers from Louisiana, because they are more understanding of the Napoleonic Code.
Yes.
Because they won't use it in France and in many parts of Europe than the American educated lawyer anyway. So it helps to have that kind of multiculturalism, even when you're a lawyer in a particular area.
True. Okay. And people aren't aware that the Napoleonic Code is alive and well and living in Louisiana these days, because you cannot disinherit your child according to the Napoleonic Code, and as you can in the United States. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Anne Craver, who has given this interesting conversation about French culture in the United States and elsewhere.
And next week, we're going to have a program about the United States and the history of Cuba. So stay tuned.
This has been Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2014.